The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all for joining us today for our year-end processing and closing procedures in Sage 100 webinar. My name is Ryan Whipple, and I work on the help desk here at SWK. Chris Glanville, the manager of the help desk, will be presenting today on the year-end closing procedures in Sage. In our webinar last week, I presented on AP 1099 and payroll W-2 printing and e-filing. Tomorrow, you will all receive an email with the links to the recording of last week's webinar and this webinar. We will also include the PowerPoint slides that you will be seeing today. At the end, we will have a question and answer session, so please submit any questions that you might have in the chat box, and we will address them at that time. And now I'll pass it over to Chris to walk you through year end.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Today we're going to talk about the year-end processing and closing procedures with a focus on the general ledger, accounts payable and receivable core modules, and the distribution. We'll touch briefly on job cost and manufacturing, and since we already had our webinar on Friday on payroll, we won't be addressing that. If, however, you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. We have contact information that will be listed on the last page. Year-end processing will happen automatically when you perform your last period end processing for the fiscal year. We strongly advise that you make a full backup of your entire Sage 100 system before you start your year-end processing, as you cannot go back once you have done the processing. We also recommend making a backup copy of your company within Sage using the company maintenance copy function. You want to make sure that all entries have been updated, all data entry posted. Make sure that any entries in all the modules have been completed, all your cash receipts done, all your invoices, any inventory transactions, physical counts before you start your processing. The other important thing to do is to review the setup options in each module before you start year-end processing. This is important because a lot of these options have number of years to save, and the default is set to 2 years for most modules. And what that means is when you close the module and you have it set to 2 years, you have last year and the current year, which is your new year, which has no information in you until you start posting. So you will lose all of your historical data. So we're going to go through and take a look at all the options and what needs to be set. You want to make sure that you make these changes before you do your year-end processing. You also want to run all the reports for the modules. There are some that are perpetual, which means you can only run them at that point in time, and then as soon as new data is updated, it will give you a whole new report. A lot of them are specific to months or years and can be run at any time. We'll go through some of them, the ones that you really should run at the time you do your year-end processing, and other ones you can review and see if there's something that would be applicable to you. You can also run your reports during year-end processing. There's a checkbox when you're doing the processing. The problem with that is it doesn't really allow you to select any parameters, and you can get a lot of extra paper that you really aren't looking for. You also have the option of printing the period end reports in period end processing. Sage's recommended order of closing modules is as follows: bill of material, work order, barcode, purchase order, sales order, inventory, MRP, time card payroll, receivables, payables, job cost, bank reconciliation, and finally general ledger. If you do not own any of these modules, you can just skip to the next one. And the reason why we do this in this particular order is because there are some modules that write to other applications. So an example is sales order processing, which does updates to inventory, receivables, and general ledger. So you want to make sure that all the journals and registers for sales order are updated and year-end processing is completed before you do your year-end for inventory, receivables, and GL. Other modules transfer information to other applications in addition to receiving information. An example is job cost, which can post invoices to receivables. Receivables can post invoices to job costs. So you want to make sure that all the journals and registers for both are updated prior to running your year end. There are also some modules that don't have period end or year end, or only have year end. Work order and bill of material are two examples of modules that don't have either period end or year end. MRP, material requirements planning, doesn't have period end, it only has the year end. So those modules don't need to be done. Prior to performing your year-end processing, these are the things that you want to look at. You want to make sure you change the module date to the last day of the fiscal or calendar year. This allows you, when you're running reports, to have the correct date. Verify that all receipts, invoices, returns, and issues are posted. Print the open PO report. Print the purchases clearing report. Review the purchase order setup options. The purchases clearing reconciliation is used to provide reports that reconcile the purchases clearing account, which is your general ledger account, with the open amounts on the purchase orders. The report includes your quantities received and invoiced, and if these don't match, the purchase order remains in a back order status on the report and in your purchases clearing account. You set up the purchases clearing account in the product line setup, product line maintenance, and it's a liability holding account. So when you do your receipt of goods in purchase order, if you don't put an invoice in at the time, there's an entry made for inventory and against your purchases clearing. When the invoice is received, it clears out the purchases clearing account in general ledger and applies it to your accounts payable. If you enter receipts in through another module like inventory maintenance, or if you change the quantities or costs after you perform your purchase order receipt of goods or receipt of invoice, the totals on your purchases clearing will not match your purchases clearing general ledger balance. This purchases clearing is one of those perpetual reports, and you need to run it prior to posting any transactions to future periods to get an accurate figure to balance to your general ledger. This is a sample of what the purchases clearing report looks like in open purchase order format. I just selected one purchase order for you to see. On this particular purchase order, it shows that we have ordered 25 of these items and received 25, but we haven't invoiced anything. It will show us our last receipt date, our order date, and if we've invoiced any, it would show us what our invoice date was. And until we do the invoice, this is going to remain on our purchases clearing report. In the setup options for purchase order, we want to verify the days to retain completed purchase orders in the current fiscal period. So if you do your year-end processing, any completed purchase orders that are more than 30 days old, the completion date is over 30 days, will be removed from your open purchase order records. We also want to make sure that our current period is set to the current fiscal year and the last month of the period. We also, in Purchase Order History tab, want to make sure that the years to retain purchase history by item and vendor is set to something besides 2 years, so that you don't run into the problem where you only have the prior year's information available. You can set it up to 99 years. Standard is between 7 and 10, but it's a personal choice. Then you would go over to period end processing, and it will come up and tell you that purchase order period end and year end processing will be performed and you will see this only on the last month of your fiscal year. You have the choice here if you want to print the period end reports. If you haven't already printed them, you can print them. If you hit proceed, it will come up with another screen and ask you where you want the reports to go. If you have that unchecked, you would have printed the reports prior to this. The next screen that comes up will tell you that period 12, ending 12/31, will be changed to period 1 for 1/31/2019. So if you go back after your year-end processing into your setup options, you will see your new fiscal year is 2019 and your new period is period 1. It will also warn you that you haven't printed the period end reports. Ask you if you want to complete your year-end processing, and you say yes, and your year-end processing for purchase order is complete. Once year-end is done, these things happen. Your expired master and repeating orders are automatically purged as of the year-end date. Completed purchase orders are purged based on the number of days to retain completed purchase orders that we saw in purchase order options. The purchase order recap is automatically purged if that's checked in purchase order options. The receipt history is automatically purchased based on the number of years we chose to select. And all purchase history and miscellaneous charges, year-to-date balances are reset to 0 as of the year ending date. Moving on to sales orders. Prior to performing the year-end processing, again, we change our module date. We verify that all invoices and shipments are updated. And we want to make sure if we're using the sales recap reports and you want them to be in sync with the sales history, you have to perform accounts receivable and inventory period end processing along with the sales order year-end processing. And you should do that prior to updating sales for the next period to have everything in alignment. You also want to print the open sales order report and review that and make sure that there's no sales orders that are out there that are old that need to be removed. And you also want to review your sales order setup options. For our sales order setup options on the main tab, we're just looking at the current fiscal year and the current period here. Verify that it's the correct year and the period 12. We want to verify the number of years to retain the sales history. Again, this will default to 2 if you haven't changed it. You can make it whatever number you want. And then we do the same period end processing. Will tell us it'll be performed for period 12 if we want to print our reports, and then it will change it once we say yes. Once we have done that, the sales order recap is purged based on the selection in the sales order options. The expired master and repeating orders are automatically purged as of the period ending date, and the sales history is purged based on the number of years we've selected in the sales order option. For closing the inventory module, we do the same, changing the module date, verifying all inventory sales, receipts, transfers, issues, and adjustments are posted. And then if you have LIFO, FIFO, lot, or serial items, you want to make sure to print the inventory negative tier report to check for negative tiers. If you do have negative tiers, they must be corrected prior to year-end processing. You also want to print the year-end reports, the sales analysis, the sales history, the receipts history. And then the inventory valuation report should be run. This is a perpetual report, so it's only current until you do postings for the next period. And you want to run the inventory trial balance. Those 2 reports should agree to themselves. The inventory valuation report is your current value of your inventory, and the trial balance is the postings to the general ledger from your inventory transaction detail. These 2 should reconcile, and they should agree to the general ledger inventory GL account or GL accounts you have. You also want to review your inventory setup options. And here is a sample of the inventory valuation report. And this shows each of the items. This is just the last page. If it's a lot or serial, it'll have that information, your receipt numbers, what you have on hand, the cost, and the extended value, and then you have your report total. Underneath is our inventory trial balance, which shows the postings. It will show you the item, the beginning balance, all the activity for the particular item, and the ending balance. And then over on this side will be the dollar amount, beginning balance, activity, ending balance, and it will do it for all items. You also have the ability to select specific items if you just want to see those, specific product lines. This you want to do for all inventory items so that you know what your general ledger balance should be. And as you can see, these both agree and they match my general ledger, so I'm good to go on that. In our setup options on the main tab, we want to verify our current period. And you can do issues and sales in Sage, even though you don't have available quantity on hand. The system lets you go negative. But it also results in a negative cost here for LIFO or FIFO inventory items. And what you need to do is you need to clear the negative cost tiers prior to your year-end processing. To do that, you would select your period end, go to inventory negative tier adjustment, and in the window, you'd click print, and it prints all LIFO and FIFO items that have a negative cost tier that have a corresponding positive cost tier that can be used to adjust it. So you may have shipped out 5 items and you didn't have any inventory. You got a receipt in for 10 items, so you will show a -5 cost tier with a +10 receipt, and the system will match the -5 against those 10 and do an adjusting entry. If there is a difference in the cost, it will post an entry to the general ledger. So if you ship them out, those 5 out that you didn't have in stock, and the cost at the time was $10, when you received the 10 items in to replace it, it was $12. It will do the adjustment of $10 for the 5 that were shipped out prior to that. And it will post that entry to the general ledger. Period end processing is the same. Tells you it's period end and year end processing and the date. If you want to print your reports, if you say proceed, it will tell you it's changing your date to period 1, ask if you want to complete, and you say yes. And for inventory, mostly it just does updates year-to-date sales information, clears that based on the number of years that you're retaining in your options. Moving on to accounts receivable, we want to make sure that the module date set, invoices and cash receipts are all recorded, that if you do finance charge calculations, those are processed and updated, any customer statements are printed. If you use sales tax reporting and you need to do that for the month or quarterly and purge. You also want to print your aged invoice report and accounts receivable trial balance report and reconcile those two together and make sure that they agree to the general ledger. The aged invoice report is based on the invoice date, and the trial balance report is based on your posting date. Those two should always agree, but don't necessarily always agree. Sometimes you may post something to the next month in error with a posting date of January with a December invoice date, and when you run your reports, you will have a discrepancy. You also want to review your accounts receivable setup options. This is an example of the two reports, your aged invoice report on the top and your trial balance on the bottom. And I did an example to show you how it cannot balance. Normally, your balance here would equal your invoice balance down here. But for this particular example, I did these two invoices with invoice dates of December. However, when I posted this one, I posted it to January by mistake. So when I run my aged invoice report, they both show up because this is based on invoice date. So both of them are in here because they're both December invoices. However, on my trial balance, this is only $2,000 because my other one is January and it's looking as of 12/31 and not finding that in there. Before you do your year-end processing, you want to make sure that these two agree and that you have fixed any problems. Reverse out the invoice that has the wrong date, put it back in with the correct date. If it's just the invoice date, you can change the invoice date in the system. We also want to look at our setup options, make sure that we've got the correct fiscal year and period. And we also want to verify the days to retain paid invoices. This is very important when you are looking at your customer maintenance screen that shows your open invoices. So if I have invoices set for 999 days to retain, what will happen is once they're paid, it goes back and it says, okay, for 999 days, I'm going to keep it on your main screen. So if you go to customer maintenance and you look at your invoice tab, it's going to show these invoices. Once I hit that 999 days and I do my next processing, it's going to roll off that screen. It's always going to stay in history, but you won't be able to see it on your customer maintenance screen. The default is normally set to 30 days, so make sure that you change it if you want to keep it longer than that. The other thing we want to look at on the History tab is the number of years to retain your customer history, your cash receipts history, and your salesperson history. And again, if we leave them at the 2, it will purge all the rest of it out and you won't have that available. And once you do your year end, it is gone. You cannot change the year back and get the information again. You would have to restore from backup. Period end processing, do the same thing. And after we close the module, temporary customers are automatically purged unless you change them in the options. The monthly sales, cash receipts, and salesperson history is retained based on the options that we chose. And the open invoices with 0 balance are removed based on the number of days to retain paid invoices that we've selected in our options. For accounts payable, we want to change our module date, make sure that all our invoices and checks are recorded. If we're closing for the month of December, we want to process our 1099s if that's applicable. We want to print the aged invoice report and the trial balance report just like the accounts receivable report, reconcile those two and verify that they agree to the general ledger. We want to print the check history report and review that and make sure that all the checks are in. And we want to review our accounts payable setup. And here's an example of an accounts payable aged invoice report and a trial balance report. And on this one, I'm showing that there's a difference. This is based on me having the incorrect invoice date this time instead of the incorrect posting date. So what I did on this one is I posted this December one into December, and then I posted this one into December with a January date. So it's going to show up in my December because my posting date was December, but because my invoice date was January, it's not going to show up on here. These need to be corrected before you do your year-end processing. So you want to make sure that you do inventory or invoice adjustments. In our options, we want to look on the main tab for our current fiscal period, verify that's correct. We want to verify the number of days to retain paid invoices. This is the same as accounts receivable. On the vendor maintenance screen, you'll see an open invoices. It will save it for however many days after it's been complete that you define here. And then when you do your period end or year end processing, if it's past that date, it will be removed from that screen. On the History tab, you want to verify the number of days to retain your vendor history and the number of years to retain your 1099 payment history. You used to only be able to retain your 1099 payment history for a couple of years. Now you're allowed to have as many as you want. You also, on the ACH tab, have the ability to save years to retain your vendor history. I'm sorry, I have the wrong tab. The electronic payment history. So if you want to save that for more than 2 years, you want to make sure that you adjust that. And then we do our period end processing. Once period end processing is complete, temporary vendors are purged, vendor electronic payment history is removed, the vendor purchase history is removed, open invoices with zero balances are removed, and if you're retaining current history, all current invoices updated to the prior year fields, and any history with no current year activity is removed based on your setup. So it's vitally important that you make sure that your setup options are set to the correct number of years or days in order for you to keep the information that you want. For our general ledger, we're going to change our module date, make sure that all processing in all other modules integrated with the general ledger has been completed. So anything related to receivables, payables, inventory, sales order, purchase order, everything should be updated before you complete your general ledger. If you're using recurring journals, you should print and update them. If you're using allocations, you should select them and post them. If you have any closing adjustments for your period, the last period of the year, you can process them through your general journal entry and update them. And you also want to make sure to print and update the daily transaction register. In the new version of Sage, it used to hold if you didn't print your daily transaction register at the time that you did your module update, it would keep it in the module daily transaction register. With the new versions, they've changed that process, and what it does is it moves it over to the general ledger daily transaction register. It only holds the current daily transaction register that hasn't been updated. So this can hold a lot of information in there, so you want to make sure that when you're doing your year end that you post this, because there might be some that got missed. Somebody said no, they didn't want to print the daily transaction register, didn't realize it, and if you go back into the module, it's no longer there, so you don't think about it. So this is an important process to do. You can also print the general ledger worksheet and the general ledger analysis if you want, and you want to print the trial balance and the standard financial statements and verify that the trial balance and balance sheet are in balance before going forward. Make sure that all the entries are there. Check to make sure that your cash account agrees, your inventory agrees, receivables and payables are correct and they tie back. That everything ties back to all of the reports that you've run before you do your year-end processing. You also want to print the general ledger detail report. This says for all periods, but sometimes the reports are so big that that's not always an option. You also want to review your general ledger options. One of the nice things about general ledger, unlike all of the other modules, is if you close this, you can reopen it. It has the functionality to allow you to go back in and change your fiscal year and your fiscal period back to the prior year, make any adjustments that you need to do, and then you will still need to perform another period end processing. But it has that ability to do that. In our setup options on the main tab, we want to make sure that we have the current fiscal period and the years to retain the general ledger history. This one is vitally important because if you leave this at 2, you are not going to get financial statements for prior years more than 1. You also want to check to see if you have reset journal numbers done. I'm never a big fan of resetting journal numbers, but again, it's a choice that you get to make. The reason I don't do it is because if you reset them and it starts reusing it and then you run a report using that journal number, you can sometimes get information from years ago that's really not relevant to what you're looking at. And then in your budgets, if you're using budgets, you can copy the actual to a default budget. You can create a new default budget. You can also make revisions using budget revision entry and update the budgets. If you have any questions on budgets, you can always give us a call and we can walk you through creating new ones. And then we have our general ledger period end processing. And if we want to print the reports here, we can. It'll tell us that we're going to do the period end and year end. And if you have allocations but haven't updated them, you will get a message that will ask you to do them. You can always say no, but it will still prompt you. Then you'll get the message that it's going to be changed to the first period, and it will close the current accounting period and cycle it forward to the next open period. If you haven't set up fiscal years for the next year in fiscal year maintenance, it will automatically create one and recalculate the beginning balances. The years to retain general ledger history determines how many years of general ledger transaction history you will be retaining. Once you've closed, any accounts with a deleted status can be removed based on activity and the selection to retain history. If the copy actual to default budget box is checked, the actual amounts for the closed year are copied to the default budget for the next year. The options for resetting the journals are performed. So if you say you want to reset them, it will go back and change them back to 1 for each of them. If the clear balances in main account maintenance is selected, the balance are cleared for non-financial accounts only at year end. And if you're retaining transaction history, all the current year information is updated. It's going to slowly load. For job cost, prior to performing the period end, we basically do the same thing. We verify that all change orders, job billing invoices, and direct costs, billing and cash receipts are recorded. Verify that all the integrated modules have posted everything. And if you're doing a monthly calculation of overhead, you want to print the monthly overhead allocation report and update it, and print and update the daily transaction register. If you've completed any jobs during the current period, you also want to print the job closeout report and update it, and print the work in process and job transaction detail report. You can't perform period end for job cost if job billing is in progress, or if the daily overhead allocation register or the monthly overhead allocation register has been printed but not updated, or if the daily transaction register has been updated for all outstanding job transactions. So you want to make sure that you have everything posted, otherwise you will get an error message that will tell you that these have not been updated and it will not allow you to go forward. During year end, the following is going to happen. The year-to-date actual cost, invoice billed and payment received totals are cleared and set to 0, along with the year-to-date dollar and unit totals. Job information is removed if the retained job cost history checkbox is cleared. Closed jobs are archived to history instead of purged if the retained job cost history checkbox is selected. And if the retained transaction detail box is cleared in job maintenance, transaction jobs are summarized. If it's selected, the transaction jobs are retained until the job is closed. Now, work order doesn't actually have any period end or year end processing, but there's a couple of things that you can do at year end. You can purge all work orders using the work order purge, that are all work orders that are closed, I should say. You can print the work order history report for the date range and you can print the general ledger posting recap. If it's not integrated with the general ledger, you can perform the purge at the end of the report. MRP only has year-end. It doesn't have a period-end processing. And basically what this does is it integrates with inventory so that you're in the same current fiscal year for your projected demands. And when you look at the projected demands, it will have your current year and your prior year, and you want to make sure that the sales are that the sales match. If you don't perform this year-end processing, they will not be in agreement. So you want to make sure that you complete that year-end processing if you have MRP. So that is kind of a brief year-end processing review. If you have any detailed questions on how to do any of this, or you want help walking through any of these modules, please feel free to email the help desk at swktech.com, or you can contact me directly at christine.glanville@swktech.com. And now we'll open it up for questions.
So we have a question here. What is your recommendation for the timing of closing? Specifically, can AR and AP be left open for days or weeks?
Usually you close AR right as soon as you've got all your invoices updated and your cash receipts processed. So that usually can be done within the first days of the next month. For accounts payable, because you're waiting on invoices a lot, either from your purchase order module or from the accounts payable side of it, that usually 10 to 15 days into the system is typical for closing. Some clients will close right away, but then you run into the issue where you'll get invoices that are dated in the prior month that you're always putting in the current month, and that can become a little problematic when you're trying to pay them.
And next question, again from Douglas. If you leave AR or AP open, can you process New Year's activity?
Yes. Yes. The system does allow you to start processing. With something like your sales order recap, it's recommended that you close your AR before you start updating your invoices, but it does allow you to do it. So your recap may not always align up correctly. If you don't use it, it's a non-issue. But it will allow you to post into the future year. Just like you can with future periods, future year is allowed as well. Same way with general ledger, you can post to future periods as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else submitting any more questions.
Okay. So if you think of anything afterwards, like I said, please feel to reach out to us. and we can walk you through any of the modules, answer any questions that you have about the order to close, what needs to be done. And thank you all for attending. We appreciate your time.